Hi, I'm Krause. I'm an associate professor here at D&E in the Biology and Environmental Science Department. And today I'm going to talk to you about attracting pollinators to your garden. So it's spring here in Elkins, yay! And after a long winter, we're all itching to get outside. But first we have to prepare for planting our vegetable gardens. And one of the things that we might want to do is to attract more pollinators to our gardens to help get lots of nice fruits and vegetables from our garden. So I'm going to talk about a few things today about how to attract pollinators, but first let's talk about how pollination works. And so I have a little plant model here, and we're going to talk about how pollinators pollinate flowers. And so you see on this, we have this mock of a flower. And when we have a pollinator, it comes by and it picks up pollen from the anthers, right? And it flies off to another flower and pollinates. So we want pollen to reach down here to the ovules and pollinates this flower. And that's how we get our fruits and our vegetables to grow. And so we need pollination, so that's why pollinators are really important. So some examples of pollinators we can find here in West Virginia. I have some examples here. And the WVU Extension Office has some great material about how to identify pollinators, and a great website through the University of Illinois gives you information on how to identify pollinators. And so the biggest differences between like bees and wasps, those can be the trickiest. And so I think we can say the difference between a hummingbird or a butterfly or a bee is pretty simple, but distinguishing between a bee and a wasp and flies can be difficult. And so there's some really great information out there. There's even an app for your phone that you can download to give you a key, to give you a guide to identify the pollinators that are in your garden. And it's important to know what you have in your garden so that you can plant according to them. And so you can find great information on the web about the different pollinators in our area and what types of plants those pollinators like. You can have information about different pollinators, and you can view specimens, and this would help you to identify a bumblebee versus a honeybee versus maybe a native carpenter bee. So these are great specimens to look at. Also for some different butterfly species, so we can identify what we have. So once we've identified the pollinators that you have around your yard, we want to think about what we can plant to help those pollinators. And one of the important things we have to think about is distance. So whether you're growing your vegetable garden in raised beds, or you're tilling up a little plot and planting right in the ground, we want to know how far these plants, these pollinators will have to go to get to our garden, to get to some of these flowering plants that we're going to plant. So we can look at different trees, we can look at different shrubs that we already have in our yards that might bloom at different times. But we can also start to think about what can we plant. The differences between an annual plant, so something that we have to plant every year that dies off, or a perennial that comes back every year, and we get a really good understanding of when those might bloom. And so we want to make sure that our pollinators have food from spring all the way into late fall. And so we could do that. We can help those pollinators out by understanding what types of plants to plant. So the first one we're going to talk about is color. So we want to identify lots of different colors in our garden to help our pollinators. So first, let's look at this geranium, right? It has really beautiful red blooms, right? And it has a scent to it. And so we want to identify what kind of pollinator might find this geranium appetizing. And so we know that bees might be interested in this, wasps might be interested in this. If it had long tubular flowers, we would think about butterflies, we would think about hummingbirds. So we want to think about color, and so it's not just reds, it's not just pinks, but purple flowers and all different shades of flowers to put into our garden or beside our garden to bring in those pollinators. The next thing we want to think about is odor, right? So shape, odor, all of these things attract butterflies, they attract bees, and they attract hummingbirds. They attract them differently. And so we want to have this variety in color, in shape, in smell, and all of these other things. But we want to have, right, low to the ground and high, and everything in between also. So these different stages in our pollinator garden can really help to attract different things at different times. But one of the key, most important things is that you have something to pollinate all this growing season. So you want to stage your plantings, or you want to pick plants that bloom at different times. So we've decided that we're going to start growing some different plants in our garden. And so one of the things, even if you're going to just do vegetables, you want to understand about your garden. You might want to do a soil test. So I just picked this up at the local hardware store. It's really easy, and it can give you information about what kind of soil you have in your garden. So if you need to add some different elements to your soil, this is really handy. Another one that I find handy is just this little 3-way meter, and it has moisture, light, and pH. And so it'll give you good information, especially pH, so we understand how basic or acidic our soils are. So we understand what kind of soil we have. If you're in a greenhouse like we are today, we don't really think about needing lots of sunshine, but you want to understand, is this a shady part of my yard, or is this a really sunny part of my yard? And then of course plan accordingly. So some ideas. If you have a shady part of your yard, you might want to plant hostas, right? They do well in shade, and they bloom. And if you have a really sunny part, like this greenhouse, right, you can get geraniums to bloom year-round. And so you have to think about how much sun does this garden spot get. And so if we're thinking about growing things like tomatoes and peppers, right, we know we need lots of sun for those to grow. And so if we're planting some flowers near these for those beneficial pollinators, we want something that can thrive in all that sun. So picking some of those, and you can go to your local greenhouse, and I absolutely support going to your local greenhouse, picking up some already planted, already started flowers. You can get annuals and perennials, biennials, whatever you want, and plant those. Or if you're itching for summer to be here earlier and want to get outside and maybe work on your garden bench, you can grab some seeds. So you should be starting your tomatoes and peppers anyways from seed. And while you're doing that, we can talk about picking some flower seed and when to start those. And I'll go through the steps here. So I just went to the local hardware store and I grabbed a handful of flowering seeds, and I got a mixture of perennials and annuals, and I got a variety of colors. You can see all kinds of colors, and I've got some that will bloom right later in the year. So this is a really great one, coneflower, purple coneflower, so it'll bloom later in the year. You can sow this directly in the ground, or you can start it early indoors and start these seeds, and so they'll bloom even earlier. Some columbine, I picked up delphinium, And then, of course, zinnia, and every garden should have marigolds, because marigold does a really great about getting rid of some of those pests that we don't want in our garden. So got those. And then, of course, sunflowers. Every garden should have some sunflowers because they're beautiful. So you can start a mix like this, and we can start seeds, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you could also find mixes like these. And so I just picked up 2 examples. This is a perennial wildflower mix, and this is a wildflower bee feed mix. And there's pros and cons to these. And so these hopefully will give you that sort of staged amount of blooming throughout the season, which is fantastic. Lots of different colors, which is also good. Maybe some different heights. But we have to be careful. So if we look at the back of the seed packet, it'll tell us what kind of seeds are in here. And we have to be careful between native versus non-native plants. And not all non-native plants are bad, right? We need some of those in our gardens, right? We want to look at those pretty flowers, but we want to be careful that we don't have noxious weeds or invasive weeds. And so we want to look for some of those in this list. And again, there's lots of great websites. DNR has a great information about invasive species. So you want to take a peek at these. If you're going to sort of get a bucket of seeds, a pollinator mix, and the hardware store has lots of these, just make sure that you're not sort of contributing to those invasive species. So you want to be careful with those. If they're in a controlled sort of setting, right, you're going to put them in a container, these might work just fine. All right, so I'm going to move a few things, and we'll talk about starting some seeds. And there really are just a few key points in starting seeds. So we want to talk about the seeds, right? Pick some up at the local hardware store. You can also find native seed growers. So I have a few here. So these are really nice because they're from West Virginia. They're nice native seeds, and you can find those. Not as common, but you can find those, and so they're really great to find. You can also order online, and so mail order seeds. That's always a really fun activity to do when it's snowing outside. I highly recommend putting in the seed order then. You want to start your seeds in something, and so I just have a tray here with some 6-packs, right? And I have a bowl of soil. So this is seed starting soil, specifically to start seeds in. You'll see that it has, right, some nice different particles in there. We want to damp that down, so make that a little wet, not soggy, but a little wet to get these started. And we want to identify light, right? So we're in a greenhouse, and we're getting that time of year where we're getting about 12 hours of light. But if you're not in a greenhouse and you're doing this at a windowsill, you might want to add a light, and they have all kinds of different ones. An LED light, growing light would be just fine and save you a little energy. You also might want a heat mat. So even here in the greenhouse, we might have to use this heat map. And that is because it might get too chilly at night. So this is nice because they'll keep it at a constant temperature for those little tiny seedlings. So a heat mat, really important to have. Nice light, good soil, and then some seeds. So we can start to think about, well, when do I want my zinnias to bloom? Do I want them to bloom early or later, and when I would start those seeds? And so if we look at, I have 2 packs of zinnia here because I love zinnias. I got 2 packs. One is called Early Bird, and one is Lilliput. Mixed colors on both. And if you take a look at the back of these seed packs, it gives you lots of great information. So you could start these seeds in the ground after the last day of frost. So Mother's Day is always a good one for Elkins. if you're willing to do it that early even. So, or you could start these early. So for early blooming, start indoors. And this says in flats about 4 weeks before the last frost date, and you cover these with 1/4 inch of soil. And then when they're 3 inches high, we thin them or we transplant them outside. It gives us information about where we're at in the country. So Elkins is a different shade of color, and it's showing these bloom April through July. The days to bloom, so 35 to 60 days. How deep we should plant them, how far apart we should plant them if we're planting them outside, and then the days to germination. So this is important, so 5 to 10 days. So in 5 to 10 days, I can come back up. I'll come back up more than that to make sure that they have nice water on them, but we'll start to see germination in 5 to 10 days. This is different for the different seeds that we buy. So sunflowers, right? We might start these in the ground, well exposed, really nice warm soil. And then we thin these when they get a few inches tall. But these take 14 to 21 days to germinate, and they take 75 to 90 days to bloom. Sunflowers, so all of these seeds are a little bit different, so you really want to pay attention to these seed packets to give you information about when you should start these and what you should expect. So if we're 25 days in and nothing has sprouted, we may have gotten a bad packet of seeds and need to start over. So we're going to start planting some seeds. So I'm going to pick these beautiful purple coneflowers. Because I want to start them early because I think they're incredible pollinator, benefiter, and they're really pretty to have in our garden. So I'm going to start these, and so we'll just get some soil right to fill our 6-pack, and you don't want these too packed in there, right? You want to just evenly fill out your cells of your 6-pack. And they make these kits, you can buy them just about anywhere. And hopefully it comes with a little dome to keep them warm, but also helps to keep moisture in. So those are good to pick up. And so we'll just start a few here. And last thing here we want to do, we want to have some plant labels so we know what we planted. It's always helpful. So we'll mark at least one of the cells of our 6-pack, and we'll open up. And remember, some of these seeds are going to be really tiny, where some of them will be a bit bigger. So these coneflower seeds, and you might want, right, this said on the packet here, it said depth of 1/4 inch, which isn't very much at all. So just a little bit here, and just lightly cover those. All right. So once we have the seeds planted, we'll just gently water this, and we'll put the dome on. We'll make sure that we have our heat mat turned on. Any kind of lights that you need set, maybe on a timer so it's getting those early evening hours so that you have good 12 hours of light. You'll have to pick that from your location. And then you'll check on them. You want to make sure that there's moisture here, so you'll see that there'll be condensation on the dome, and you want to just be really gentle taking this off and making sure that this is nice and damp. You don't want waterlogged, but nice and damp to get those seeds started. Once you have those plants started, and they're a few inches long, you might thin those out. So again, we're putting 2 or 3 seeds in each of these cells. So you'll thin those out to the very best one. And the last thing I would recommend would be maybe a little fan in here or wherever you're starting your seeds. When they get a little bit stronger, you don't want them to be too leggy. so that they fall over when you transplant them outside. So you might want a little fan, just a light breeze. Sometimes we get one in the greenhouse, but not often. So a little fan to help those plants get a little sturdy. Before you plant them outside, you'll want to hardy them up. So put them on the back porch for a few hours at a time, every day, longer and longer, just so they're getting hardy, they're getting accustomed to the temperature and sunlight and everything outside. So once we have our seeds started and we've given them a few weeks, our tomatoes, our peppers, everything else we're going to put in our garden, and our flowering plants, we're ready to start getting outside and preparing our garden. So you've already found your spot, whether that's in raised beds or directly in the ground, and you've probably tilled. And so you've prepared that site, you removed weeds, or you've put down weed barrier or something. You've tested your soil. And so now we want to make sure that, we have the right nutrients in our soil. So if we need to add any fertilizer, any compost is really great. Manure, any of those things to get that soil really ready to grow our vegetables. And so we would directly plant those and put our flowering plants either on the outside of an in-ground garden. You can do every other row. So marigolds are really good to put on the border of your garden to sort of protect those from pests. But some plants like zinnias, they attract some really great pollinators, and so you might want to plant a row of these in the middle of your garden, or every few rows in your garden, adding some of these great pollinator plants. You can also just keep them in containers so that you can move them around, you can change them out to keep those blooms steady if you don't want to plant these flowering plants directly in the ground. So that will get you started with your garden. So you could keep them in pots and then just move them around so that those flowers are always there. When you start to see things flowering in your garden, that is the best time to identify what other pollinators you might have. So you might find new pollinators in your garden because you've attracted all kinds of things. And so you can keep an eye out for those new pollinators and identify them and identify any other needs they might have. So you might need a water source. So bees, butterflies, birds, all kinds of things really appreciate a bird bath or a water source. Some like moving water, some like still water. You can also add bee boxes or a bee house for those carpenter bees and other bees. If you have a neighbor who has hives, you might see those honeybees coming to visit your garden. And so you want to make sure that you have nesting habitat, hiding places, and other things for some of those beneficial pollinators in your garden. Okay, all right, thank you. That's all I have. We're going to have some Q&A now. If you have any questions about attracting pollinators to your yard, testing your soil, starting seeds, any of those things, I'm happy to answer those questions. Thanks.